Our panel is described as the crisis of values in relation to Václav Havel legacy. As many of the speakers mentioned, it's a very wide theme, so we will concentrate mainly at the beginning at the current Ukrainian crisis, threatening the values and then asking very urgent questions. Where are the limits of support for Ukraine in the light of nuclear threats? What is at stake and so on? And then we will move on possibly to any other themes that you might find interesting. So now it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists. On my left hand is Marci Shaw, the Associate Professor of History at Yale University, and she wrote numerous books and publications on Central and Eastern Europe, including The Taste of Ashes and The Ukrainian Night. Marci, it's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome. It's Jacques Rupnik, Research Professor at Sciences 4 in Paris.
I was applauding you. Or you're applauding me.
He was educated at Sorbonne and Harvard, and again, he wrote numerous books and publications on the changes in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989. Welcome, Jacques. Yeah, Michael Žantovský. He's a diplomat, politician, writer, translator, and current executive director of Václav Havel Library in Prague. He's also an author of Havel's biography, A Life, who was published in 2014. He was close associate of Václav Havel, his spokesperson, and he was then Czech ambassador to United States, Great Britain, and Israel. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Vladimir Tismăneanu, Romanian-born American political scientist who is now with Professor of Politics at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's also an expert in revolutions, 1999, Leninist legacies, memory, responsibility, morality, etc. Welcome, yeah, Vladimir.
Etc. More. Primarily, etc.
Primarily.
Responsibility, morality,
okay, so let's open our discussions with your opening remarks, intro, reflecting on the crisis of values in the light of Ukrainian struggle for freedom and self-independence. Marci, would you start?
Sure, absolutely. First, welcome everybody, and welcome to the students. Oh, sorry, let me try that.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Welcome everybody. Thank you especially to Milan for inviting us all. Welcome to the students. I'm going to try to watch your faces to see like what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So if I'm not making sense, just look confused, you know, and I'll try to clarify. So these are very broad topics. We were just saying to Jacques that maybe, you know, today we could also resolve all the problems of the existence of God and the meaning of life, and we could just take care of all that this morning, and then we could move on. Since this panel is about values, I decided that I would start with one that I think was very important to Havel, and that I would make an argument kind of comes to Havel, especially through Patočka, or in dialogue with Jan Patočka, and that's responsibility. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately in connection with this war. You know, responsibility as a value. And I will try not to talk too long. Maybe I will just throw out two moments in Havel that I think illuminate his ideas about responsibility, and then my friends and colleagues here can respond. So Michael here, who is the translator of the famous speech that Havel gave to a joint meeting of the United States Congress in February 1990. There's a very famous line from that speech, which I don't expect all the students here to know, but I'm glad I know my colleagues here already know. I was, at that time, it was right after February 1990, I had just turned 18. It was my last year of high school. I knew nothing about anything. but I was very caught up in the drama of the moment. It was really the moment that kind of brought me to Eastern Europe, a place about which I knew nothing, largely through the very beautiful translations of Paul Wilson, who kind of seduced me into reading Havel because they sounded so extraordinary, and they were in a language that no American politician had ever spoken. And I was very drawn to that language. There was something very romantic about it. At that speech that Havel gave in Washington in February 1990, he stands up there and says, and this is Michael's translation here, consciousness precedes being, and not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. And later Martin Palos said that somebody commented to him, one of the American journalists, like, wow, if I could talk like that, I would run for God. Now, I think there's a very good chance that no one in the American Congress remembered that moment in German ideology where Marx and Engels talk about being preceding consciousness. It's very possible the reference was totally lost on everybody who was present. But as someone who teaches intellectual history and teaches Marx, it's become very important to me, because Marx's idea was that consciousness, how one thinks, is essentially derivative of your objective position in the materiality of the socioeconomic order. And so you're a worker, or you're a factory owner, or you have a position, in a certain structure, and that is what structures and determines your thinking. Being precedes consciousness. Consciousness is fundamentally superstructure for Marx. It's derivative. It's not causal, it's derivative. And what Havel, it seems to me, was saying here, and Michael may have other ideas, he can certainly jump in since he's the one who probably knows more what Havel was thinking, is that consciousness precedes being, is that how we are thinking, how we are processing the world, how we are understanding the world, what we are saying, that is prior to, and in some ways transcendent of, our objective position in the socioeconomic order. And for me, that has been a kind of manifesto of responsibility. Wherever we are, whatever the conditions might be, we are still responsible. That kind of responsibility transcends anything else. And this was one thing that I think brought Havel and Adam Michnik together. Adam Michnik's idea of as if, and Vladimir could speak to this as well, we live as if we were free people taking responsibility for everything we say and everything we do, regardless of any constrictions, regardless of constraints. That responsibility is always already with us. I think that's what he was saying in the 70s and 80s. And just a couple years ago, literally 2 or 3 years ago, before the war, but still during the Trump catastrophe, my husband and I were having lunch with Adam in Warsaw, and I was tearing my hair out, and I was like, I don't know what to do. I feel helpless. You can't go here, you can't go there, there's no, and Adam says, never say that. Never say there's nothing that can be done. I have always told myself, in every situation, it's always possible to do something. And for me, that's been a kind of manifesto that comes from Havel. Now, Havel says in the famous story about the greengrocer in Power of the Powerless, that he learned from Jan Patočka, the thing about responsibility is that we carry it with us everywhere. So maybe I'll just leave it with that, and I'll let my colleagues jump in. I mean, I have much more I could say, but I don't want to dominate our introduction. So
Thank you, Marci. Jacques, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Great pleasure to be here. And is Milan Babik here? No, he's not. But anyway, thank him for the invitation. Yes, if you had to define Havel, you would start there. If you're moving more, because students sometimes ask, where would you put Havel? Where would he belong? And I say, the best answer, you read Kolakowski's essay from the 1970s, How to be a Conservative Liberal Socialist. And that really confuses them. And, but it is actually the closest to the truth, because you can find in Havel, his, Michael spoke about it yesterday, the concern for the environment, for the world we live in. Well, you can say this is, in a way, a conservative. You want to preserve something, you want to conserve. Liberal, yeah, politically he's a liberal, definitely. Not just human rights, but he believes in liberal politics, and believes in social justice. He repeats it. So everybody can find in Havel something, and but you don't want to separate the three because they belong together. So he ticks all the boxes, or rather, he doesn't fit in any of the boxes. So that is, I think, the interesting thing. You say, which values? Well, he combines in his person, but also in his engagement, in his political commitment, he combines those. So that, I think, is the interesting thing. Now, of course, perhaps the interesting thing about what happens to values with somebody like Havel is when an intellectual is then confronted with the exercise of power. Because the sentence Michael quoted yesterday, which is, that there are things that make sense regardless of the consequences. Maybe I'm not quoting exactly, but that's more or less the gist of it. Well, that's clear. Sorry. Yeah.
Doing fine. Yes.
I'm doing fine? Okay. Memory is still there. So that is a dissident position. You take a stance on something regardless of the consequences. Yes, and there can be consequences, and for Havel and his friends there were consequences. They were actually put in jail, etc. So in that context, in the dissident intellectual context, that sentence makes sense. If you become head of state, it's a different proposition, because then responsibility comes in. And you take a position, you cannot say regardless of the consequences. No, there are consequences. You must take them on board. You must sometimes back down on some of your preferences, which doesn't mean renege on your principles. And yes, you would call this, you have to accept the politics of lesser evil. There are situations where you just don't do, this is a position regardless of the consequence. It makes sense regardless of the consequences. No, because there can be disastrous consequences with the great principles. And we know many situations like that, great principles leading to disastrous consequences. So in a way, that idea of responsibility, in my mind, changes once you move from the dissident intellectual posture, the primacy of the ethical stance, to the ethics of responsibility, which is the classic intellectual dilemma, the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility. Now, how am I doing? I can go on. But you told us to say something about Ukraine. Maybe in the second round, I'll get to that. And
okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Jacques. Michael, you told me yesterday you'd prefer to talk about virtues rather than values. What do you mean by that?
Thank you.
The virtues.
Thank you for that question, and thanks.
Mike.
Mike?
Yeah, Mike.
Yeah. Well, Mike.
Yeah, it is working.
Is it working?
Yeah, it is.
No?
I'll try to, yeah? Something like that.
Okay, this
Yeah?
is
It's
the
better?
technology. Yeah. Okay. I'll try to be careful. Anyway, I wanted to thank my predecessors for mentioning some of the central Havel's concepts and ideas, and I find it, Marci, amazing that you were not here last night, so you couldn't have known that you pinned down exactly the same sentence I started my talk with from the speech to the joint meeting of the US Congress. And, but I'm slowly realizing that all of us here are Havel people, and it will be left to me to be the crisis people, because this conference is about the crisis, and we are to speak about the crisis of values. And that's why I believe that the very concept of crisis and the way of values and the way it is viewed and perceived these days is maybe one of the factors contributing to the crisis. I mean, in modern analytical philosophy, the postmodern, philosophy, reality is value neutral, and values are just human projections. Justice or wrongdoing, truth or lie are a matter of subjective perspective. So there's no room there for moral values, which are, if they exist, they are not a matter of subjective perspective. So it made me realize that actually values are somewhat modern concept. I mean, it's not in ancient philosophy, you don't find much about values or hear about values. It's a concept that replaced an older concept of virtues. And virtues, although they also defined in various ways, are in the view of the old philosophers basically standards of excellence, outside our subjectivity, and something to which we all aspire. And things like tolerance, righteousness, truthfulness, generosity, honesty, fairness, patriotism, responsibility are some of the ancient virtues. And of course, most of them can be translated into the language of values these days, but we have forgotten or stopped using some of them, and on the other hand, we introduce some new concepts which we present as values. And to illustrate what I have in mind, we in Europe are always talking about the European values, and sometimes we're not quite sure what they mean. And but we have some documents in which the values are listed, and the Treaty of Lisbon, our current document, aching to a constitution but not quite there, lists some of them as the values of the Union, namely respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And I think it's hard to argue with the list. It's something.
It's a good start.
we should all agree on, but there are some items, at least for some of us, missing from the list. There's nothing about justice. There's nothing about truth. There's nothing about generosity. Nothing about honesty. Nothing about temperance. And as Marci suggested, nothing about the central concept of responsibility. And on the other hand, we in Europe have some, and in the United States as well, we have some values which are subject to controversy, to culture wars, and so on and so on. And these are things like, family values. We have a controversy about those. Capital punishment is the clear division line between Europe and the United States, and we Europeans feel very virtuous in comparison with the Americans, because we are all against capital punishment, have always been against capital punishment. No, not really. I mean, in the 1970s, we were still executing people in France and in other countries. Okay. You mean, as the Germans put it, einmal ist kein Mal, yeah?
One too many. One too many.
No, it's not something that has been with us for centuries. It's been with us since prosperity came to Europe and peace came to Europe after the Second World War, and we, went that way. But the question is, would we stay that way if things became much harder, much more contested? If I don't want to paint alarming pictures, but if terrorism in a major wave came to Europe, you would expect calls for the death penalty to be reinstated, etc., etc. And it's the same with concepts like patriotism. We feel these days we can do without patriotism, or we can replace patriotism by a European identity. And again, we are halfway there, and we are arguing about which way to go. Secularism is also another thing that many Europeans consider a value, but some are not. So what I'm driving at is that values are, or maybe can be, ephemeral, whereas the virtues, responsibility, truth, generosity, are the things we should base our conduct upon, and they are here to last. I will stop here.
Thank you, Michael. Vladimir, your thoughts on a crisis of values in the light of Václav Havel legacy?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here and allowing me to be with very close friends and make new friends. So I'll try to be brief. I was telling 5 minutes. I'll try to look into the time there. So the first thing to be said is that to be a follow-up to Michael Žantovský's presentation yesterday, to the end of his presentation, was about the return of fascism. So what kind of fascism are we dealing with? Is it postmodern fascism, as Gaspar Miklos Tamás once wrote about? Is this a composite, very heterogeneous type of fascism that it's a kind of bricolage that collects from different places? It's all of them, obviously, or at least obvious to me. Second, following Michael's, for me, inspiring presentation yesterday, I jotted down a number of thoughts this morning. Thanks to Facebook, I know what I published a year ago. So, so a year ago was 80 years since Babi Yar. So today is the Babi Yar 81st anniversary or commemoration. Remember that a year ago, Babi Yar monument had not been bombed. Now we live in a world in which the Babi Yar monument in Kiev was bombed. So I was thinking, what kind, I'm not going to go into details. Babi Yar is the ravine next in Kiev. It used to be the outskirts and is now center of Kiev, I think. And Marci, is it in the center? Yes, it's in the center of Kiev, Babi Yar. More or less. Broadly defined. Okay, but it's the ravine. 30,000 people were killed. So I'm going to say what I think about the legacies of Babi Yar and the problem of fascism, especially since we have all this discussion about the Italian elections and so on and so forth. So where is fascism in the story? Havel was very concerned about totalitarianism in general. So he was a closet Arendtian. He would not quote very frequently Hannah Arendt, but he was clearly inspired to a great extent by some of her ideas, including the ethos of responsibility that Hans Jonas actually developed very much. It was a book which was very famous in Germany at a certain moment. So about Babi Yar. So the massacre happened 81 years ago, in late September 41. The name of the Kiev ravine is frightening in itself. It bears witness forever to the millions of Jewish people, murdered in what our friend historian Timothy Snyder called the Holocaust by bullets. For decades, the Holocaust was taught and thought of as the Cyclone B Holocaust, the gas machines, etc. Because under the Soviet rule, the rule under which both the leader of the aggressor and the leader of the aggressed grew up at this moment, I mean Putin and Zelensky, under Soviet rule, the peculiar suffering of the Jewish people was basically glossed over. The monument that created a famous moment in 1961 was the publication of the poem by Evgeny Yevtushenko, Babi Yar. Okay, Khrushchev. I speak Russian, so I can pronounce Russian. Okay, Khrushchev himself reacted to the poem. Okay, so the idea was that these people died as Stalin put when they banned the black book of the crimes perpetrated by the Germans against the Jewish population that Ehrenburg and Vasily Grossman put together. It was banned because, according to Stalin, these people died as Soviet citizens, not as Jews. Okay, so what we have here is, okay, let me try to find my last, okay, so the horror was perpetrated by German military, inebriated, some of them Waffen-SS, some of them Wehrmacht. So it's not only a Waffen-SS fringe behavior. It was the mainstream of the German occupation army. Okay, so basically the horror was perpetrated by German military inebriated with Nazi racist delusions. Here we'll go back to Havel in a second, and then I'll finish because there are other things I'd like to say, but later, perhaps. Okay, so keep in mind, German or Nazi racist delusions. That brings us into the problem, which is central, if I understand correctly, Havel's philosophy, the problem of ideology. I think that without focusing on ideology, which is the crucial concept in the power of the powerless, when he, it's basically explicit ideology, implicit ideology, total ideology, particular ideology, but it is very important. The matrix of the greengrocer's behavior, which is unconscious, is basically endorsing a certain ideological wager, a certain ideological vision. Okay, so we're here at a conference which deals with Havel and our crisis. Let me say, the UN experts last week have confirmed that Russia has committed war crimes in the occupied territories of Ukraine, much to the dismay, I suspect, of the powers that be at Amnesty International. Okay, so who continue with their obscene behavior, by the way. They've reached the point that I consider them an obscene at this moment organization, the way they behave regarding the war in Ukraine. So, and I will be ready to elaborate on that. The mass massacres in Bucha, Mariupol, and Irpin did not happen decades ago. Let's keep this in mind. They happened this year, in 2022, Anno Domini. Okay? Now, maybe as we talk here right now in this wonderful city, college city in Maine, another massacre takes place, and another mass graveyard is built. So, what is the consequence? What I try to say. By the way, Michael made a very good point. No, it's Jacques who made that point about the ethics. What kind of ethics do we have in this story? We have both ethics. I remember a conference with Tony Judd years ago where Tim was there, and I remember with Eric Hobsbawm we had a very interesting conversation. So the issue was, what's his name? The very famous British Grover. Okay, so he made the distinction between ethics of intentions and the ethics of consequences. This is a very important dichotomy, I think. So, these are consequences of an ideology. In this case, a murderous ideology. So, what ideology? And with this, I'll finish. What ideology do we talk about? And I'll try to apply later how this ideology operates along the lines of the ideological self-reproduction mechanism that Havel analyzed in The Power of the Powerless and other essays, and not only Havel, but we're a conference on Havel. Okay, so the ideology, and remember the number of books and the number of topics which were recently banned in Ukrainian higher education, and I think also high school education, among them any propagation of the Ruschist, whatever, combination of Russian and fascism ideology. There is such an ideology, it has to be identified, and it's clearly inspiring, whatever people say, that everything in Putin is whatever. I'm not going to go into all the Putinology, there are other people who can do it. I think I can handle a good discussion on that, but we'll have a team to discuss. So, for me, Putin's Russist thugs treat Ukrainians as, listen to patched great philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, that this idiot took the name Vladimir Solovyov, okay, who is a criminal, truly a criminal. He's the Yuri Streicher of the Putin regime, okay? So I hope that he will have the same fate, but you told me that Europe doesn't have the death penalty anymore, so they are going to enjoy their Côte d'Azur castles and so on. Oh, Solovyov has a huge villa in Monte Carlo. Yeah. Okay, which was frozen at this moment. So this ideology for me, which dehumanizes the other, in this case the Ukrainian. Those who committed the mass crimes were committing them with the conviction that the Ukrainians there are not worth a life. So in other words, the value, if we are to go into value, it's the worthfulness of life versus the worthlessness of life. This is where I see the major distinction. So between, if I were to be Freudian for a second, between the eros and thanatos, between the instinct of life and the instinct of death. Putin is at this moment, I name it generically, the imperial ideology of the Russian Empire. I can go. So Putin is basically reconstructing the cult of death, which was at the very heart of the fascist ideology. So to conclude, Putinism and the other related ideologies, including Orbanism in Hungary, are what I call the real 21st century fascism. Whatever Meloni is and Le Pen and so on, they are just marginal in this story for me. The story is the big narrative, the big story there is what's coming against all the values of the civilization. And with last point, Havel was a fighter for NATO enlargement. Remember that much of Russism is that NATO provoked Russia. It goes way back, Mary remembers, in Pittsburgh at the conference we had at AAASS, when I managed to infuriate some of the good friends who were against NATO enlargement, and it was what, 95, 96, okay? And they said, what would Russia say? And in front of a large audience, I said, I don't care. Send Russia to the therapist, okay? They didn't send Russia to the therapist, so we have the consequences.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir. Okay, I'd like to move on. What this responsibility, what these values, virtues, how do they translate into action in the light of the current Ukrainian crisis? We see a country being attacked by clearly totalitarian regime. We hear nuclear threats. Where are the limits of support of the West for Ukraine? Do you see them somehow? I found a quote of Václav Havel from 2003, when there was a big discussion about the intervention in Iraq. I have usually leaned toward the opinion that evil should be combated in its germinal stages rather than its developed form, and also toward the belief that human life, human freedom, and human dignity represent higher values than state sovereignty. That's Havel in 2003. We know how Iraq intervention ended and so on. I'd like you to comment on the similarities, dissimilarities between this intervention and Ukraine. I'd like to get to the point, where are the limits, for the support of Ukraine when facing the threat of clearly fascist state? Where do you see it, Marci?
Okay, it's unfortunate Tim's not on this panel because he's very interested in this Iraq war comparison. He was very engaged with that question at the time. Okay, let me answer that by maybe going back to what Jacques said about Kolakowski's essay, How to Be a Liberal Conservative Socialist. And again, for the students here who don't necessarily have that essay in their head, which was published in the 1970s, Leszek Kolakowski was one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. A Pole, a former young Stalinist turned revisionist Marxist, turned not Marxist at all, came to a position, to some extent in dialogue with Isaiah Berlin, that values conflict. That some good things exclude other good things. That the great slogan of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, assumed that you could have absolute liberty and absolute equality. But in real life, those things are often in tension with one another. And for that reason, it's very difficult to find a pure space, an innocent space. Justice often works against mercy. To some extent, it kind of goes back to Hobbes. You're trading off liberty and security. And Kolakowski here is saying it may be that, in the interest of more social justice, you have to restrict freedom. But in that case, we should at least say what we're doing. We shouldn't call it a higher form of freedom. We should say that we're compromising on freedom, in the interest of this other goal. And I want to bring up two cases here. One of which I think we're going to see maybe tomorrow night is a text that I teach a lot, but I haven't seen it performed in 25 years, which is Havel's Audience play. A one-act play starring Havel's kind of alter ego Vaniak, who is an intellectual, a dissident, and I hope I'm not spoiled. Can I talk about this, or am I going to spoil it? Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to spoil the play for those of you who haven't seen it. I've read it many times at this point, but there's a brilliant illumination of this in this play that I like to use for my students when I teach it at Yale, which is, so Vaniak, who is the intellectual, who is the dissident, who is looking for work because it's illegal not to have a job, and he's been thrown out of what he can really do, and there's this kind brewmaster at a beer brewery who agrees to take him in. Clearly a good guy, a decent guy, knows that this is a flabby intellectual who doesn't really know anything about physical labor or making beer, and so tries to give him some kind of easy assignment. But of course the cost for that, for the brewmaster, is he is then asked by the secret police to write weekly reports, about this dissident intellectual who's working for him. He doesn't want to get anyone in trouble. He has no hostile inclinations. He doesn't love the regime. And he's kind of stressed about this situation because, he's an ordinary, working class guy. He doesn't, what does he know about writing a report? He's never written a report, and so he goes to Vaniak and immediately confesses and says, they asked me to do this. And, of course I don't want to get you in trouble. It's really very stressful for me. So, could you write them yourself? I mean, really, it would be easy for you. You're a writer. It would be child's play. Come on, you can say whatever you want. You don't have to get yourself in trouble, and it would really take a great burden off me because it would be really a struggle for me to put together a text. And Vaniak is saying that, and Vaniak is sympathetic. He likes the guy. He said, I really appreciate what you're trying to do for me, but the thing is, as a matter of principle, I can't participate in a practice that I find immoral, which is, spying on people and writing reports. And there's a moment at which it's I'm butchering it in my paraphrase, but you should all see the original. There's a moment in which the brewery master breaks down. He's like, well, what about me? What about me? What am I good for? I'm just the shit that your principals can stomp on, but you want to keep your hands clean, but what does that do to me? And it's comic, it's absurd, but it also lays bare the moral dilemma. because you see Vanyek's point of view and you see the brewmaster's point of view. No, you see that like he wants to keep his hands clean. If you participate in this practice, you're contributing to the regime you're fighting against. And if you leave it on the brewmaster to do it, you're putting him in a very unfair position, you know, and you're kind of inflicting all the guilt on him. And this kind of laying bare of the impossibility, you know, of any innocent space, of the conflict of values, was I think that's one of the best kind of literary illuminations of that. Another one I'll mention, again, especially for the students who may not have read these texts. So one of the great women of the 20th century was a Czech Jew named Hedda Margolis-Kovály, who, going back to what Vladimir said about Nazism and Stalinism, she appears in a roman A Clef by Skóretsky as the woman who has been to hell twice and is still very much alive. I mean, she's no longer alive, but she was a Czech Jew. She survives the Holocaust. She survives Auschwitz. Her husband miraculously also survives in different camps. They come back to Prague after the war. They join the Communist Party. In the camps, the communists were the best people. They were the only ones who had a vision of how the world was going to be afterwards. He becomes a very high-ranking official. And her husband, Rudolf Margolis, is then one of 14 people put on trial in the Rudolf Slansky trial in Stalinist Prague and hanged. So she lives through, I mean, she lives through Nazism, she lives through Stalinism in a particularly concentrated way. She comes through it all, you know, with extraordinary strength. She writes an extraordinary memoir, which is, I think, the best thing I've ever found for students to get at that intersection of Nazism and Stalinism. So if you haven't read it, you should all read Hedda Margolis-Kovály's memoir, which is translated into English Under a Cruel Star. And it will give you an immediate feel for how those things are connected. And she's a translator. I mean, she's a literary translator. And later in her life, she writes a crime fiction novel, which was only translated to English and published after her death. It's called Innocence. It is set in Stalinist Prague. For those of you who like crime fiction, it's not my genre, but I read it because it's her book. I reviewed it for the TLS. And in some ways, it's light reading, and if you like crime fiction, you'll like it. It's a great book. But there's also a message underneath, and you see how all the characters are implicated. You know, even everyone trying to do the right thing, you know, still gets implicated in this totalitarian system. And the novel is called Innocence. And what she's trying to tell us is that there is no such thing. But she's not trying to say that doesn't mean like we give up. And I think that was true for Havel and that was true for Kolakowski. The fact that values conflict, you know, the fact that there's this scene between Vanyek and the brewmaster doesn't mean we say, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. We have to kind of live in that tension between values and still take responsibility. Stop talking.
Jacques, what are your thoughts about the limits of support for Ukrainians so that we don't fall in the trap of what happened to Iraq intervention? What are the limits?
Well, first, I mean, to connect the Havel position to your question, his stance, the quote you gave, that there are certain values, principles, human dignity, human rights, etc., that have primacy over sovereignty, over state sovereignty. That's the idea of what was called le droit d'ingérence, the right to intervene, or the duty, then it became the duty to intervene, to protect certain rights. These were the 68ers who, you know, Bernard Kouchner, etc., who said, you know, there is a famine in Biafra. It started with the doctors. You have to save the people there. You know, you are thinking of revolution in Paris, where meanwhile there are people dying in Biafra. So you start with 68ers becoming humanitarian, engage in humanitarian action. Human rights becomes the post-68 ideologies, if you want. And Havel and the dissidents, of course, has their own version of that. It was not the same, but their own version of the idea that these principles, these values, have primacy over sovereignty. This is why they called on international bodies to intervene and to support their demand for the implementation, let's say, of the Helsinki Agreement, the third basket, etc. There are things that are more important in international diplomacy. So this is where this idea that the international community, which doesn't really exist, but or let's say it only exists where a bunch of influential states decide that they will act. And so that's where the idea of the 68ers, let's say, as I put it, perhaps unfairly, and the dissidents converged in this idea that there are things that are more important than state sovereignty. So when Yugoslavia broke out and there was a war in Bosnia, I was then executive director of the International Commission on the Balkans of the Carnegie Endowment, and we met with Havel, of course, the whole group of the commission, you know, with Geremek, with Simon Veil, with the Belgian Prime Minister. We had a very distinguished group, and we had a fantastic, amazing conversation with Havel on those issues. And he very much believed that the right to intervene, including military, to stop a war, to stop ethnic cleansing, as it was called, or you could say to stop genocide, whatever you want. So that was very much his position. It had this continuity from the human rights dissident struggle. In the context of the Bosnian War, it took this particular shape. Now, then came Iraq, and I was going to say and destroyed it all, because there you have then an intervention on fraudulent pretext. So you say there is a war. I mean, I will not inflict on you the whole thing. You know the letter, you know, the weapons of mass destruction, Al-Qaeda. Okay, so you have there suddenly the destruction. And the problem for those of the dissidents who initially supported the war was then terrible to confront that question. That you want to live in truth, and there is a war carried out with lies. This is a big, serious dilemma. And you can always say, but they did the right thing for the wrong reasons. Or you can turn it around and say, no, they did the wrong things for the right reasons. You have your variation on this theme, but it's a real dilemma. And Adam Michnik backtracked. He's one of the few courageous people who then wrote an article in the New York Review with Janos Kish, who was a dissident but an opponent of the Iraq war. And he wrote with him, basically saying that he had been wrong, but he had been wrong because he did not fully have these answers. So, yes, in the Ukrainian context, we are now confronted with the legacy of that. We, as the international community, or we as the West, etc., are in a way also, our public opinions have been constrained by that. I mean, remember when there was Syria intervention, stop the war, 400,000 dead, intervention. And it was stopped, you know why? When British Parliament did not give the vote in the Commons. Why? Because you have taken us for a ride once, you will not do that again. And once the British said no, then Obama pulled out, and the French president, who was for it, was all dressed up and nowhere to go. So that's so. Yeah, it has consequences. You know, when we discuss, yeah, you have principles and consequences, and if you do the right thing for the wrong reason, or the wrong thing for the wrong reasons, this is has happened to be the case. And Tim is much more sanguine than I am on this subject. So he's not here, but I heard him in those days. We had discussions. He was much more sanguine than me on the subject. But yeah, there is a real dilemma then, and our public opinion nowadays are very much constrained by that. The idea of intervention, the idea of projection. So that doesn't mean you can't do anything. Right? There is support, and there is massive support for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine would not, I mean, their resistance is theirs, and their determination is theirs. And, that requires that our respect and for many Europeans, the surprise and amazement at their determination. But of course, they couldn't do all that without our support. And that support is generated by the way they have framed this war. I mean, Zelensky has made now dozens and dozens of speeches on this, but very early on, in his speech, for instance, to the European Parliament, this was on the 1st of March, so, you know, days after the conflict started, where he says, this is a war against us, but it's also a war against you. This is a war about values. Our panel is about values. This is a war, you know, between those who are committed to defending certain principles, democratic principles, values that Europeans share and which are under attack from Russian imperialism. And he framed it in those terms, and that was heard by Europeans and in the European Parliament in those terms. And that is crucially important, because suddenly it puts Ukraine on the European map in a different light, because it's not just, oh, an Eastern post-Soviet country, faraway country of which we know nothing. It is a country that claims to be part of our family, and it is actually fighting for that. And that changes the picture, because Zelensky framed that war in terms that, especially in Central Europe, resonate. We are the kidnapped West, to use the Kundera phrase. And that was a key Kundera sentence, his essay about the kidnapped West, and that contributed largely in the 1980s to changing the mental map of West Europeans vis-a-vis Central Europe. The influence of that essay is just enormous, which incidentally has been republished now. Already sold out, the French edition, the second edition, 12 languages. So the essay is about Europe and Russia and about values and how to define them. And of course, it's a 40-year-old essay, but somehow the way Zelensky framed the conflict rings that bell again. And that is, I think, the basis for the way the Europeans today respond to the Ukrainian war.
Michael, you've mentioned it in today morning. We might face a situation tomorrow where Russia annexes another parts of Ukraine by this, you know, fake referendums like Zaporozhye, Kherson Oblast, and whatever, and then claim if you attack these regions, you attack Russia. So it's a, you know, huge dilemma for the West and so on. How to avoid this Iraqi trap? How to avoid being driven mainly by the Ukrainian aspirations, but being driven actually, or staying true to the virtues or values of the democratic West? What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, I don't know you can. As Jacques said, moral stands have consequences, and that's why most people prefer to avoid moral stance. And some unique people like Havel and a few others don't. And I think we should recall his actual influence on actual developments and events during the period he was the president and shortly afterwards. I mean, Bill Clinton explicitly admits that two people, maybe he lists three people, but two people I remember, who persuaded him to intervene in former Yugoslavia were Václav Havel and John Paul II, the Pope. And it was a very difficult decision. I remember when I came to Washington as ambassador, I mean, the mood was not to intervene, to leave it to the Europeans, etc., except the Europeans couldn't stop it, and the result was almost 200,000, dead people. And then the international community, led by the United States, intervened, and it stopped. on Iraq, Havel supported the deep, removal of Saddam Hussein. I mean, in so many words, and he never recanted on that count because he was convinced that Saddam Hussein committed atrocities against his own people, that he used chemical weapons against his own people. He never got involved in the debate about WMDs. Which was the pretext and the wrong pretext we now know that led the United States to attack Iraq. But on the moral position that Saddam represented evil and should be done away with, Havel, never thought twice about it, and he would never think twice about the current situation in Ukraine. It's what Vladimir said about the ideologies. I believe what is stunning about this conflict is the almost total absence of ideology. What people like Dugin and Soloviev pass for an ideology may affect dozens of confused of Russian intellectuals, but it has, as far as I know, it has no really public resonance. It's the ideology, such as it is the hatred of us. It's hatred of the West and the values and the principles it stands for. And Havel famously said that the problem with Russia is that it doesn't know where it begins and where it ends. And this statement is sometimes misunderstood as confusion about Russian geographical boundaries, but it's something more than that. And I think the best illustration of it is that as long as Ukraine developed in the late 1990s and early 2000s along lines which were very similar to what happened in Russia as a semi-authoritarian kleptocracy with no really real democracy, no really rule of law. Putin didn't give a hoot about Ukraine. It was free to rot there along with Russia. The moment the Ukrainians, had some ideas of their own and said, maybe it's time to introduce some freedoms and rule of law and move west and think about joining the European Union, that moment they became the enemy, because that moment they became us. And it's not something, in my mind at least, we have a choice in. I mean, we are, whether we like it or not, we are a target, and what would happen if we gave up on Ukraine would almost certainly be the total takeover of Ukraine by Russia, and the next thing would be, the Baltics, the Poles, the Ukraine, the Slovaks, and the Czechs.
Even the Czechs.
Even the Czechs. So it's rarely so clearly defined as them and us, and And we are in this for better or worse, and we have to stand the course.
Okay. I promised to, we're running out of time, I promised to give you a chance to ask the questions. I think we have a space for one or two. Is there anybody willing to ask the question? Do you have a microphone?
Do you need a microphone? I don't need a microphone.
Okay.
When did it?
That is the one.
No, I'd like to reinforce what Jacques said. When we gave the inaugural dinner the night before Havel became president, the German ambassador asked to come to the dinner, not to see Havel, because Havel was going to be there. And Havel had written a letter or a statement saying that the Czechs should apologize for their treatment of the Sudeten Germans. And he was going to Munich the next day and then to Berlin. And Bill, my husband, Ambassador Lors, was there present at the conversation. And he said, Václav, you're going to be president of a country tomorrow. It's different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody else? Is there anybody? Do you want to react, Marci?
Yeah, maybe if I could just say something like a little bit personal then in response. I'm always speaking too personally in these contexts that are somewhat formal. But when I came to reading Havel, when I came to reading the East European dissidents, I was a young peacenik. I was mourning Abby Hoffman's death. I considered myself a pacifist. I was very drawn to the spirit of nonviolent resistance, to the Helsinki Accords. The first person I met when I came to Prague, which was the first time I had crossed the former Iron Curtain in 1993, was the philosopher Bohumir Janat, one of Patočka's students, who signed the charter. And I asked him about this, why did you choose nonviolence, as a means of resistance? And he said, well, violence is a tool used by cowards who refuse to carry their own existential burden. And I have stood by that. That's been deeply in me. I've never let my kids have a squirt gun. When my son begged and pleaded for a Nerf gun for his 9th birthday, I absolutely refused categorically. And last week I had Ukrainian friends and colleagues who said, we need you to come down to Washington. We need long-range, high-precision missiles now. And I found myself in these meetings with senators on Capitol Hill saying, you must send long-range, high-precision missiles to Ukraine immediately. Now, this was a situation I never, ever in my life would have imagined I would find myself in. And I have to say, I did it. I'm not saying I was great at it. Clearly I'm someone who knows nothing about missiles. I did it with no ambivalence because I had no doubt that at this moment it's absolutely necessary and the right thing to do. And that's something I'll be processing still, I'm sure, for years to come, assuming the world still exists.
Yeah. Michael, you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning several of our friends in relation to the concept of freedom and responsibility. I would just suggest that there is no clear equivalence between freedom and responsibility, because responsibility is always a constraint on your freedom. You know, it's antagonistic to the concept of unbridled individual freedom. You're free to do what you want. That implies very little or no responsibility. With Havel, responsibility, and he writes about it repeatedly, comes out of the awareness that there is something higher beyond the horizon of our everyday experience that is watching over our acts, and that the acts will one day be judged, as Václav Havel writes. And so for me this is a higher, more complex concept of freedom imbued with responsibility, as opposed to freedom as absolute irresponsibility, which is also a variety that many people practice these days.
I'm afraid we have to end here. The time has passed. I would like to thank to Marci, Jacques Rupnik, Michael Žantovský, and Vladimir Tismăneanu for a wonderful discussion. I would like to thank you for your questions, and I would like to invite you for a next roundtable that starts in about 10 minutes, right here. Thank you.
So, welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Konrád. I'm a Czech cultural journalist, and in this period of Václav Havel's often paradoxical life, I've been asked as a non-native English speaker to guide you through a debate about language. The purpose of this conference is to tackle some of the major issues of our times while drawing on the legacy of Václav Havel, first Czechoslovak and first Czech president, whom, of course, we greatly encourage you to read, but don't expect you to know in depth. We've got wonderful guests, each coming from a different background, hopefully will provide an inspiring perspective. Having said that, let me introduce them. Each of them will give a brief opening statement, then we'll talk a little among ourselves, then we'll open up the floor for questions. Hopefully this time we'll do it a little sooner than last time. So having said that, our first guest sitting next to me is Paul Wilson. I'll give him a proper introduction. He's a Canadian writer, editor, journalist, and translator who lived in former Czechoslovakia from 1967 to 1977, joined the Czech underground movement, and sang in a rock band famously persecuted by the communist regime called the Plastic People of the Universe. Aside from that, Paul translated Václav Havel's books and plays, as well as novels by great Czech writers such as Bohumil Hrabal and Josef Škvorecký. Please welcome Paul Wilson, and Paul, give us your remarks if you can.
Right now?
Yep.
Okay.
Let's do it like this.
Thank you very much, and welcome. Thanks for coming out. When I was looking at this theme of the crisis of language, I'm a language student. I studied English literature at university, and the word crisis and language have never really seemed to me to go together. If you look back in the history of English literature, the great periods. You can't imagine Shakespeare and Marlowe sitting around a bar in London talking about the crisis of the English language, when in fact what they were doing was enriching it. If you go forward through the centuries, the next century, the person who might have possibly talked about the crisis of the language would be John Milton. But he was more concerned about censorship and the curtailing of public discourse and argument. I can't imagine Keats or Dickens or any of these 19th century writers talking about the crisis of the English language. In fact, the first time we encounter this in literature is in the 20th century. And I believe that it coincides partly with the arrival or the rising of of totalitarian dictatorships, namely in the Soviet Union and then in Nazi Germany. I want to draw your attention to some writers other than Havel who have actually dealt with this, the so-called crisis of the English language long before Havel did. One of them is a frequent resident of Maine, E.B. White. Now, you may know him as the author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and some other children's books. But he was actually a very eloquent defender of democracy, and he had, as what he would call, a love affair with freedom, and wrote marvelous essays about this. But he was one of the first to actually realize that the ideas that were being put forward by the Nazis in Germany were actually infiltrating into the public mind in the United States. This was long before Twitter, long before hackers, long before anyone, any sort of technological way of influencing other countries. But he noticed that people, this is just around the beginning of World War II, before America decided to go in, people were making arguments that were very much like the arguments coming out of Nazi Germany. Democracy is a mug's game. It doesn't work. Maybe what we need is stronger leadership. And he was very dismayed by this and wrote a lot of essays talking about the danger of this kind of defeatist thinking, which he felt was an infection coming in from abroad. Then the other, one more thing about White was that he was very concerned about how shall I say that? He wrote a book called, which is, everyone here should know it, called The Elements of Style. And it was a book that taught and gave some precepts about how to write clearly. I don't think it's any coincidence that a person who wrote so clearly and encouraged other people to write so clearly was also very clear-minded about the threats that were coming through linguistically and otherwise to a clear perception of what was going on in the world. The next writer would be George Orwell. And coincidentally, George Orwell also wrote in a very clear style. He also gave advice to writers about how to write clearly. And he was also incredibly sensitive to the influence of ideas coming from, and in this case, the Soviet Union. And he noticed that and wrote a great deal about how a lot of English intellectuals were actually supporting either Nazi Germany or the communist regime in Russia. And he said that this is partly responsible for the shoddiness of a lot of English writing. And he said that the English language was getting really, really turgid and muddy, and it was very hard to carry on a clear discussion. And he said the process is reversible, but we really have to work at it. So both Orwell and E.B. White argued that one of the greatest weapons that we have is clear thinking and clear writing when it comes to confronting totalitarianism. That brings me to Czechoslovakia, but not quite to Havel yet, because there's another writer who was very famously clear, famously anti-Nazi and anti-communist, and was a proponent of the new Czech democracy. His name was Karl Čapek, and we have actually in the audience we have a distinguished translator of Čapek with us. So anyway, he was, I would say, a visionary. I mean, he wrote a play about robots in 1920. He wrote a play called, called Biela Nemoc, the White Sickness, about a pandemic. He wrote a play about the danger of blowing the world up. actually it was a novel. And he wrote a play also about the, it was called The Insect Play, but it was about how army ants sort of war with each other, and they were kind of, they were metaphors for Nazi Germany and the Russians. So that brings me to Havel, and one of the first essays that I translated by Havel was something that, it was a speech that he gave in 1965 to the Writers' Union, and it was called On Evasive Thinking, and that sort of lays out his critique of the misuse of language, not by the communists, but by the reform communists, the people like the Dubčekists. He was extremely critical of their kind of slippery language, trying to come on as Democrats, but actually they were still using the same jargon and the same infected language as the people they were trying to break free of. And so his early plays were all about the kind of misuse of language. Although he never used the word crisis of language, he was instrumental in kind of laying this out in a very satiric way. So his early plays were incredibly popular in Prague, because he first was one of the first playwrights to actually grapple with the absurdity of a society that was ruled by a total ideology. And I think, Michael, you were one of the early sort of adapters. I mean, I think when you were 15, if I'm not revealing too much.
15 is right.
Yeah. You actually went to see these plays and felt their influence.
I saw the Garden Party, I think, 8 times in 1964.
We'll get to that in a minute.
So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Paul Wilson. Our second guest, who hasn't spoken here yet today, Martin Putna, sitting next to Paul, is a distinguished Czech literary historian, essayist and translator, winner of the Tom Stoppard Prize, former director of the Václav Havel Library in Prague, author of many books ranging from Russia's cultural and spiritual history to Václav Havel, A Spiritual Portrait in the context of 20th century Czech culture. He's been also an unspoken critic of the Russian regime basically for as long as Vladimir Putin has been in power. He's one of the prime targets of Russian trolls on Czech Twitter. And most importantly, he's the professor of social and cultural anthropology at the Charles University in Prague. So please welcome Professor Martin Putna.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, speaking of language, basically I cannot speak English. If people ask me how many languages you can speak or read, I say, I very much hope that I master my only language, which is Czech. The other languages I just am trying to observe and to compare and see their good and weak aspects, etc., etc. So I apologize very much. This is really like a goat gardener to let me speak in English about language. Nonetheless, you didn't say one thing about me, one important thing. I'm a nasty, angry man, usually. And the majority of Czech society hates me. The fascists, definitely, and the Havelians as well, because I'm not devoted to Havel enough. And my book about Havel is quite critical. I don't think that Havel is a thinker. I think Havel is, when it comes to his really spiritual context, his ideas, his so-called ideas, I think he was rather a sponge, sucking very cleverly ideas from his family, from his neighborhood, from his friends, from his teachers, and basically everything that we can find in his texts and that we quote, like that is a wisdom, that is also wisdom, and Havel used to say Well, usually you can find it earlier either in Ivan Havel, in his
the brother
text, or in texts of his teachers, Tomáš Halík and Zdeněk Nobover. And this is one of the problems of English audience or English intellectuals who are unable to, which is definitely not their fault, to read in Czech, that they cannot understand the broad context of the ideas and also of the language. And I think his only really original ability was that all the things he absorbed in himself to let go farther in a broader audience in a simplified way. That is why he was only one he was capable of becoming a head of state. Only he was capable of putting together the dissident movement, whose members were communists, Catholics, the evangelicals, Protestants, the Jews, atheists, alcoholics, whatever kind of people you can imagine. And he was the only one capable of putting it all together. And then, having become a president, to coin some sentences, some phrases that became famous. And this is something not secondary. If I, in the beginning of my speech, I told that he was not the original thinker, but this is an original quality, which only he himself possessed. And in this aspect, he resembles of the first Czechoslovak president, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, influenced so much by the American culture. Cherche la Charlotte, his American wife, who basically was so much influential. And Masaryk was much more original thinker, definitely, than Havel. But also, Masaryk had this one single quality to be capable of coining the phrases that people can remember, and the masses can remember and repeat and say, yes, that's us, that's our identity, what this man says, this is us. And so I think the Havel's originality and uniqueness basically consists in language, not in thoughts, not in ideas, but in the language. And last sentence, coining phrases, coining those paroles, etc. On the other hand, as Paul mentioned, to describe and observe and show in grotesque way the false language, the language of totalitarianism. And if we sometimes are thinking, what would Havel say about today's crisis? I think one thing he would do, he would be capable in a genial way to do. It is to make a parody of this identitarian language, of this Putin Russist language of family values, national values, of all this bullshit. He would be, I believe, he would be capable of making fantastic grotesque of this identitarian fascist language. And since he is he's over there somewhere, it's up to us to make fun of this Putin's language, to defeat Russia and make fun of the Russian and of others, dictators, totalitarian leaders' language, to make fun of them, because that is what makes them furious, to laugh at them.
Thank you. Thank you for the wild remarks. Sitting next to Martin Putna is Michael Žantovský. For those of you just joining us now, I'll give him a proper introduction as well. Michael Žantovský is a Czech diplomat, politician, writer, and translator who served as spokesman to President Havel, later became the Czech ambassador to the United States, Israel, and the Great Britain. He's the executive director of the Václav Havel Library in Prague, the same institution that Martin used to be the head of.
Michael Žantovský also translated many novels, ranging from Norman Mailer to Toni Morrison. He's the author of Václav Havel's biography called Havel, A Life. And last but not least, 14 years ago, he mentioned it briefly yesterday, but Michael, while he was still a diplomat, he published a spy novel in secrecy, which includes massive protests in Belarus, Russian invasion, and Russia cutting gas supplies to Europe. So please welcome the foresightful Michael Žantovský.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I promise this is the last time I'm speaking at this conference. It's,
and you trust yourself?
And I'm not about to get into an argument with my friend Martin about whether Havel was a thinker or not. But I think we will both agree that he was most certainly a writer. And for writers, language is the most important thing. And Havel worked with language and wrote about language all his life, and his talent that Martin mentioned to coin language that was that quickly became viral in today's parlance was uncanny. Paul has mentioned my early or first experience with Havel. I saw when I was 14, I saw the garden party, and then I went to see it again and again, and all my friends did the same. And we knew the play by heart. You know, we could quote the lines to each other and had an enormous fun doing that, because it was debunking the official language of the regime in the most funny way that no one could approach. And the same experience many other people had, or younger people had years later with the audience that you're going to see tomorrow. Again, you know, parts of the play have become a part of popular language. It's you know, ain't them the paradoxes, right?
Ain't them the paradoxes, right?
And but there's one occasion on which Havel tried to write about language and its crisis more systematically, and that's his 1989 address to the German Booksellers Association on the occasion of receiving the annual Peace Prize. And he wrote an essay which is called Word About Words, and he starts with pointing to the magical qualities of word. He says that starting with the word that was at the beginning, you know, the words have had magical power, and that they can prove mightier. Havel said that 10 military divisions. But in the speech he also remarked on the dual purpose quality, the ambiguous quality of words, the capacity of the same word to cause good or to cause evil. He said the self-same word can be humble at one moment and arrogant the next. But even as he wrote the speech, there was a lingering doubt permeating it about what he sensed as possibly the waning power of the word. He said, is the human word truly powerful enough to change the world and influence history? And even if there were epochs when it did exert such a power, does it still do so today? And while he was in the opposition to the communist regime, arguably the word still had such power. But it had something also to do with the nature of the regime, the scarcity of words, the censorship, the constraints compared to the overabundance of words today provided for, you know, a higher value of word than the devalued, inflated power it has today when we are bombarded by words all the time. And I think the current use of language by Russians in the aggression against Ukraine is most instructive. My mind, it goes one step further than propaganda, even the Goebbels propaganda, which is always trying to pervert language and spin language and demean everyone that is opposed to you and glorify everyone that is on your side. The Russians, on the other hand, play, you know, some version of a children's game of reversing tables. Every revolting aspect of their conduct is preemptively presented as an integral aspect of the conduct of the enemy. You know, war is peace, that is pure Orwellian, or war is a special military operation. Russia invaded Ukraine to protect itself from aggression. It's trying to denazify a regime led by a Ukrainian Jewish comedian. You know, it invaded with 200,000 troops to demilitarize a country that was not militarized at all. It is determined to defend itself by using nuclear weapons against what they call the nuclear blackmail by the West. You know, heard of it? It's, you know, even from a psychoanalytical point of view, this is pure projection. You know, it projects all the West inclinations into others. And the words inevitably lose all meaning in the process. And this is the novel method of propaganda, in which rather than to impose one's own meaning on words, all meaning is destroyed, creating a world in which, as our friend Peter Pomerantsev puts it in his book, nothing is true and everything is possible. Yeah? So, you know, it seems it is much more cost effective to make people believe in nothing than to make them trust your own version of the truth. But I will end up with a glimmer of hope that remains somewhat paradoxically, as Havel put it in his speech, quote, one who has learned that words still count for something when you can still go to prison for them. And we know that in Russia today, people go to prison for using the word war. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Michael. Our last guest who just arrived in Maine last night, you all probably know. Some of you may be among the, at this point, I think hundreds of thousands of people watching his online course from Yale called The Making of Modern Ukraine. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University, the author of Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, or The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. He's a recipient of multiple prizes, including the Literature Award of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Václav Havel Foundation Prize, and state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, or Poland. So please welcome Professor Timothy Snyder.
Okay, as was said, I arrived late, and I have the pleasure and privilege of speaking last. So I'm going to riff on the themes that have already been raised about language, but I'm going to start with a little experiment. My colleagues began with the slightly, I think, ridiculous, framing that I don't really speak English, and therefore I'm going to speak English, and I can't possibly have anything to say about language. Whereas I think it's quite the contrary, in fact. That we all need some way to get a bit of distance on the words that we use, and speaking another language or just observing another language can be a way to get distance. So the experiment starts with this. What's the Czech word for 5? Any non-Czechs out there know it? Okay, any Czechs? Czech word for 5?
Piet.
Piet.
Piet. Yes. Okay. The Polish word for 5 is pięć. The Ukrainian word for 5 is piat. All right, they sound alike. What could that possibly mean? How is that possibly interesting? What's happening in your head when I make those sounds? Piet, pięć, piat. What is this called if I hit you? What's that called?
Punch?
In English, punch. It's called a punch. And the drink that the students who are not here today had last night, what is that called?
Punch.
Punch. Now, what does this and punch, is that just a coincidence that they're called the same thing? Has this ever occurred to anyone? It's not a coincidence. A punch is called a punch because I have how many fingers?
5.
5.
Sure.
And the drink punch is called punch because originally it was made with 5 ingredients. And the Slavic word for 5, piat, pięć, piet, recalls that original sound from an Indo-European root, which we all share in these languages. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because now that I've said this, the way that you think about the punch that you drink and the punch that, of course, you would never actually use because we're all about the mocny here, but you're never going to think about punch and punch in the same way again. And you're probably going to remember, I mean, if you're sober now anyway, for the rest of your lives, that there are Slavic words for 5, and that those Slavic words for 5 have something to do with punch and punch. We don't think in words, or at least I don't think in words, but the words that we hear and the words that we read change the way that we do think. Whether it's attending the garden party at the age of 14 or 15, when we are exposed to words, exposed to the richness of words, exposed to unexpected combinations of words, that changes the way that we think. The words that I was thinking of as I listened to my colleagues were words from precisely Power of the Powerless. I think the most important words in that, which I take the point they're not entirely original. I'm very comfortable at this stage in my life with the idea that people synthesize other people. The other day I was in a conversation with a literary scholar who said, yes, Julian Barnes, sort of mid-level. And I thought, well, then I'm very happy to be in the mid-level amongst the people who are, synthesizing other people's ideas. I'm very comfortable with being there with Julian Barnes or Václav Havel. But the words that stay with me, the most important words for me in the essay, The Power of the Powerless, which is Havel's most well-known essay, are the 3 words most probable states. His argument about, one of his arguments about politics is that the kind of politics that we have, or the kind of politics of the 1970s, or the politics of modernity, or the politics of normalization, push us into our most probable states. And that this is what is fundamentally wrong, that we're in our most probable states. Not in our improbable states, but in our most probable states. And I think this, for me, this is the most insightful part of Havel's argument, that our problem, our weakness, the way we generally become unfree, is that we become probable, or we become predictable to other people, or in our own time, predictable to machines, which in turn allows us to become predictable to other people. And the case I want to make about the language, or the crisis of language, or the significance of language, is that language gives us a richness which allows us to become improbable, or which allows us to do things which are not predictable. And I think that unpredictability is close to the heart of what Havel means by freedom. And I think that's actually, I mean, I take the point again that that's not an original insight. There's Patočka, and there's Kosik, and there's a whole Czech tradition, and other traditions which can lead us there too. But I think his most powerful insight is that freedom has more to do with unpredictability than it has to do with logic. And it has to do with rationality in a narrow sense. So language being something that we create, I'm just going to riff on this idea for a moment, and you'll just have to humor me. So thinking of plays, right? So the creator, probably the richest source in the English language, aside from the translation of the King James translation of the Bible, is Shakespeare. So probably the most important, we can debate, but let's just take Hamlet. Conscience makes cowards of us all. This is all from the to be and not to be speech. Conscience makes cowards of us all. Slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, right? To be and not to be. Now, who was Hamlet? Hamlet was a prince of Denmark. What are the Danes? They're a post-Viking state, right? What is English? Well, among other things, it's a language that was spoken on that island, which was influenced by those Vikings from the north, right? Who also invaded in 1066 and failed. But 3 days later, in 1066, the French invaded. Who were the French who invaded? They were the Normans. Who were the Normans? The Normans were post-Viking people. What did they bring to England? Well, they brought a version of the French language. If they hadn't brought a version of the French language, Shakespeare wouldn't be saying conscience makes cowards of us all, because conscience is a French word. And here's one point where I disagree with Orwell. Orwell was said, you know, you have to use the English parts of English, which I think is nonsense. You can't just use the English parts of English. The French parts of English make English much richer. But we don't think about how they're richer, and we don't think about their unpredictability unless we have a way to take some kind of distance on them, right? So you can't talk about slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. I'm aware that fortune is not originally a French word or even a Romance word, but if it weren't for French, we wouldn't be talking about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or the uses of adversity, for that matter, to take a phrase which you will remember also from Timothy Garton Ash's book of the late 1980s. The uses of adversity, which is also Shakespeare. We're not going to be talking about that without French. Okay, you take the point. So the languages give us a sense of the unpredictability of it all, because after all, did the Normans have to win in 1066? And if they didn't, then English wouldn't be the way that it is. English is not a fixed thing. What if the other Vikings had won from Norway in 1066? Then English would be a very different language, and there wouldn't have been an Orwell telling us not to use the Anglo-Saxon parts of it, because there would only be Anglo-Saxon parts of it to use, right? Languages, like everything else, mix together and mold together, and they push us into places where we didn't expect to be, but we have to have a certain amount of consciousness of this whole process. And so one way to understand the references that colleagues have made, for example, to Orwell or to Peter Pomerantsev, and by the way, I can't resist saying, Michael, but I mean, nothing is true and everything is possible is Hannah Arendt. That's Peter Pomerantsev quoting Hannah Arendt, who is another person who is very conscious, as Peter is, of the importance, I think, of the unpredictability of language and the care one has to take with language, right? When Hannah Arendt is asked what remains after National Socialism, was bleibt, die Muttersprache, what remains? The mother tongue remains, the language remains. My daughter does not remain in this hall. I hope she's somewhere that I can find her. Okay. Yeah, maybe somebody should go look for her. Where was I? These two. Pluralism is overrated. Okay, was bleibt. So one way to understand the reference to Orwell would be concern for the impoverishment of language. So Orwell was concerned in 1984 about the way the language could be made smaller. The language was made smaller. The plot of 1984 involves an office where the protagonist works, where they're constantly revising newspapers and they're rewriting dictionaries, so the dictionary has ever fewer words. And the idea is that with ever fewer words, there can be ever fewer thoughts, which is a simple thought, but I think it's fundamentally correct. In our day, that labor is being performed all the time, but is being performed automatically, not by people in an office, but by the way the internet works. So the internet is herding us into groups where everyone uses the same words, and it's ever fewer words. And if you just, I mean, I'm sure none of you ever go on Twitter or Instagram or anything like that. You probably don't even know what I'm talking about. I'm sure like none of you is on Twitter right now or anything like that. But if you followed the threads on, not the threads, the comments on Twitter, you'll realize that people are all using the same 25 words basically over and over again. And they're not using the word conscience. They're not using words, they're using the same sets of words. And it's not just that the internet makes us dumb because we're with dumb people, that's true. It's that the way that the algorithms are set up is designed to get us into a very narrow place emotionally, but also in terms of our vocabulary, and then that becomes a way to live. And there's a politics to that. The politics of that is that we become predictable. As our words become predictable, our thoughts become predictable, and our political actions become predictable, and we become easier to rule. We are pushed, in other words, into our more probable states. And so how do we get out of our more probable states? We have to find ways to demechanize ourselves. And an example of the politics of all this is the Russians, precisely. The Russians understand all of this, and they've tried to use all of this. And when one looks at what works in response, and I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this later too, think about the Ukrainians and Zelensky. The way that they handle the Russians is they don't do more of the same. They do a bit like what Martin was recommending. They make fun of it. Or, more fundamentally, they tell a story. Right? What is Zelensky doing? And Zelensky is a man he's a Jewish comedian, but what is a Jewish comedian? He's an actor. When I asked him, when I talked to him about politics, we made some of the same references, but he said everything is in Shakespeare, which got me thinking. That's probably one of the reasons I'm talking about Hamlet now. But he's an actor, right? And so one of the things that he's doing constantly is that he's creating. And so then, and that I think is his appeal, because when we're in this Russian world or this internet world or this world of ever more impoverished language, where we're constantly being herded into these ever narrower caverns of language and thought, someone who comes along and tells a story without qualifying himself, without hesitating, and simply does it, simply performs, simply creates, simply uses language in a way which is fresh, then we think, oh, actually, that's something very good, and maybe there's a way out of this crisis of language. So, thank you.
Thank you. Picking right up on that, and one of the things that Professor Snyder was saying, that the words we use change the way we're thinking, and also connecting that to what Michael Žantovský mentioned, the current use of the Russian language in the war. Could you, Professor Snyder, for example, could you explain to me, so as you say, language is not well in Russia. The war that's waged on Ukraine is not war. It's called a special military operation. It's waged against the so-called Nazis, which means anyone who either speaks Ukrainian or considers Ukraine to be a sovereign state. We've seen the referendums, which means staged elections. We've seen most recently in Russia last week partial mobilization, which effectively means allows the mobilization of any Russian man, and practically takes men, especially from the Asian part of Russia, the way I understand it. So when so many words fail to describe reality, are we in a situation where language actually created some new reality for Russians? Or how do you interpret what goes on in the minds of ordinary Russians when so many words describe something else?
Yeah, that was to me. Yeah. Okay.
That was to you.
So, I mean, I want to hear what colleagues think about this too. It's harder and harder to get into the minds of ordinary Russians. It's harder and harder to be there. You know, I can't go there at all. Some of this is speculative, but I do think that the state of Russian public opinion, if that's the word, becomes less surprising if we talk the way that we've been talking. Because if you take for granted that the kinds of processes that we've been describing are not just, academic rhetoric, but are in fact social processes, then what's happening in Russia starts to look less Russian and more like a human possibility. Mm-hmm. So another thing which Havel says in Power the Powerless is that the fact that people can live in conformity, it just shows that this is a human possibility. It's not the only human possibility, but it is a human possibility. The fact that we do it shows that we can do it. The fact that the Russians live like this shows that not just Russians, but that people can live like this. I mean, for me, the crucial elements are inequality of wealth, because inequality of wealth allows for inequality of media production. In Russia, you have the extreme where you have the fake pluralism of the handful of television stations, which are in fact showing the same thing over and over again. And the simple thing that they're showing again, which is fascist, is a politics of us and them, where there's a chosen enemy, and the chosen enemy is the West. They chose the West deliberately. And that everything falls into that cycle of us and them, us and them, us and them. And that us and them, I think by no coincidence, is a binary feeling, right? And I think that it is related to actually the binary language that we're all falling into thanks to the internet. The internet thinks in a binary way, we don't, and when we compromise with it, we become more and more binary. With words themselves, I don't know about the rest of you, but I've been trying to listen to Russian soldiers and what they say themselves, and it is clear how, for example, being in Ukraine forces them to enrich their vocabulary. So for example, the word Ukraine itself. So if you follow the Russian soldiers when they invade Ukraine, they don't use the word Ukraine because Ukraine doesn't exist, right? There's the enemy, right? There's the enemy, they're the fascists, they're the Nazis. But after a few weeks or months, if they're still alive, they start talking about, I'm sure they don't notice they're doing this, and I'm sure they don't mean it as a gesture of respect or anything, but they start talking about Ukraine, the Ukrainian state, and the Ukrainians, which I find very interesting because it's a very concrete example of how, it's a terrible example, it should never have happened, it's not a laboratory we would wish to exist. But it's an example of how experience in life enriches your vocabulary when you come from a controlled world of media. But I want to hear what other people have to say about this.
Right. To bring perhaps Paul Wilson, and Paul Wilson sang in a band at a time when Czechoslovakia was living under a totalitarian regime. Right. So, Paul, the way you understood it back then, is the mechanism that we're dealing with similar as it is in a pop song, where a pop song has a chorus, you repeat the chorus over and over and over, and eventually, just as the song unknowingly gets stuck in your head, maybe to the Russian propaganda and at the time the Soviet propaganda, is it enough to repeat a lie so many times that you start to believe in it at some point?
No, it didn't. My experience is that the more often those lies were repeated and the more often the Soviet slogans were repeated, the more people reacted against it. One of the girlfriends of the lead singer in the band once said to me, I've seen so many anti-war movies, I would just welcome a war instead of all this stuff about peace, 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 peace. The other thing is that I think Orwell was, he was satirizing the narrowing of language, and he invented this construct called newspeak, which was meant to limit what you could think and what you could speak. But when I got to Czechoslovakia, I realized that there's the language of public discourse, which is ideology and controlled by ideology, and there were the way people actually spoke in real life. And most of the Czechs that I talked to were, and my friends, my acquaintances, did not use any of that language. They, in fact, the spoken Czech became very inventive. It became richer and richer and richer because people were reacting against this barrage of propaganda, and they were very inventive about it. So I had a long conversation back just before they expelled me with a friend of mine who had signed Charter 77, which meant that he was under police surveillance and he'd been interrogated many times. And we argued about whether Orwell was right or not about his vision of the future. And he said Orwell was a terrible pessimist. And he said, and this is a man who had been treated more or less the way Winston Smith was treated, minus the torture. But he was saying, Orwell was wrong about the heel of the Nazis, the heel of dictatorship crushing people forever. And so I think I've sort of evolved a kind of idea here that oppression creates its own opposite, and that the harder the oppression, the more refined and the more precise the opposition to it comes. The regime tried to crush the band that I played with. They tried to crush the underground, and the effect was exactly the opposite. It gave them more power. It gave them more influence, and the harder the police came down, the more people either flocked to the band or created their own bands. So in the 1980s, when I wasn't there, there were hundreds and hundreds of rock bands that had sprung up while the police were paying all their attention to the Plastic People and the underground. This other rock scene developed, and it was it was not just the Plastic People that brought down the regime. It was the regime that actually created its own opposition, and fostered it unbeknownst to itself. So,
right. There obviously won't be enough time to talk about Havel's plays in detail, but let me bring up at least two. Michael Žantovský mentioned one of them, the Garden Party. Written before the Garden Party, I believe, is in Czech it's called Vyrozumění. The English translation is the memorandum.
No, it's after, actually.
After,
yes.
Okay.
No, he wrote it first, but produced it later.
And
precision is everything.
Yes. And so the memorandum takes place in a bureaucratic office, in an office which starts implementing a new bureaucratic language, a made-up language, let's say. Though it inevitably references the communist era of the times, I'm sure at least the humor of the play won't be lost on anyone who ever worked for a corporation and received an email from an HR department, let's say. It's really widely entertaining. But more seriously, to me, when I read it these days, that play says something to me about a system or in an environment where the individual's only goal really is to go with the masses or the ideology, to follow the ideology and the rules, even if you don't understand them. In this case, it's the language at the core of the play, where eventually you rid yourself of any identity. That's the mechanism of the play. If we take the Zahradní slavnost garden party that Michal Žantovský mentioned, that again, that's a man actually using language to gain power, to rise in the ranks. If I'm not mistaken, Michael, at the end of the play, he talks about himself, Hugo, in the third person. It's a complete loss of identity manifested, as just you could imagine. When we look at Havel's plays and Havel's use of language these days, Michael, for example, or Martin.
Yeah, well, especially the early plays are all about language, and the memorandum Vyrozumění is a play about language that is an artificial language and that's been invented to remove the unpredictability from communication between people, so that everybody knows what everything means, except you don't have a permission to learn the artificial language TDP until you had your memorandum, and because the memorandum is written in TDP, so until you've learned the language, you cannot read your memorandum.
Catch-22 situation.
That's a catch-22. But you know, I was intrigued by what Tim said about the link between language and freedom and improbability, because Havel was very consistent in thinking about this, and he had a theoretical model. Actually, his brother, as we know, Ivan, was a mathematician and a physicist, and the model for Havel was the second law of thermodynamics. You know, the whole of universe tends towards entropy, and entropy is the state with the most probability, where everything is the same and there's no distinction between elements of the state. Whereas for Havel, freedom was a rebellion against entropy. It was and it was largely achieved through language as a means to reach the least likely, the most individual, and the most interesting, if I may, state of affairs. And in another play, the increased difficulty for concentration, which is not as well known because he wrote it in 1968 and other things took over when he premiered it, is there are lengthy passages about entropy and how to fight it. So, yeah.
Can I say something? There's another aspect to Havel's plays that is very important, I think, and that is that it created a community. I mean, the community of the people who went to see the plays, like you and your friends. There were, I don't know how many hundreds, how many maybe thousands that went to see them. They all had the same experience of seeing a play that kind of laid bare or made fun of the state that they were living in. And I don't think it's any accident that you went to that play and you ended up as Havel's spokesman. I mean, there's a kind of a continuity there of community that grew and grew and grew, even in the 1970s. You know, when things were really tough, there was a very strong sense that more and more people were kind of joining the what Havel called the secret life of society, and that's a really good slogan, I think, from his letter to Dr. Husak. He felt that this sort of veneer of peace and calm that normalization had created was really not what was happening, and that underneath there was what he called the secret life of society was burbling up and would eventually burst through, and it did.
If I may, let me bring in one more idea into the debate. The Havel's use of phrases. This is something that seems very distinctive to me in the early plays, for example. But also in Havel's final play called Leaving, which describes a politician leaving power. It's a chancellor who's exiting politics. All throughout Havel's works, you'll find the use of phrases. Havel lets the characters repeat certain phrases over and over, sometimes just to show how empty they are, sometimes it's got a larger arc. And sure, politics is full of phrases, don't need to talk about that, but if I were to connect this with the Russian war in Ukraine, for example, you may remember early on when the war started, the American embassy offered Ukrainian President Zelensky to evacuate him outside of Kiev. And Zelensky famously declined by saying, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, which to me is the beautiful kind of a phrase which actually has substance. That's not an empty phrase. He was really living that. And so, Professor Putna, maybe, when you mentioned in your opening remarks Havel's capability of simplification and phrases that people remember, is this in any way inspiring to you? Is there something we can take from Havel's, let's say, use of phrases? And
the question is what it is we, what it is us. Because this
any of us, ideally.
Because one of my concerns about this wonderful conference, who is it us? I told you I'm a nasty,
combination of friends and students, let's say.
Angry man, always criticizing, making philosophy with hammer. And one of the problems of the Havelian world, so to speak, is that it is closed in itself. That basically it's old friends speaking to old friends. To those who remember, to those who met him at least once when they were 16.
Look, I'm not old enough to have met him, so that's not the case.
Nothing wrong about it. Nothing wrong about it. But you are the youngest person in all the program, and I would be interested to listening some young or younger American academics who is interested in Havel and who does not the personal experience, who was born in 1989 or even later, what he or she understands from the phrases. How he or she would understand and comment on the phrases. Would it be still understandable or not? Because we know that Havel's plays and ideas are popular in Ukraine, Belarus, in countries where there is a totalitarian regime of similar case. But America is completely different, and today's generations of students are entirely different. And I'm trying.
So I got a suggestion. Let's ask the American on stage, Professor Snyder.
He's not young enough. Sorry.
I'm not as old as I look. That's very, in a way it goes to the essence of some of the things we're talking about, because it really does depend upon us and how we use those phrases and where we direct them. One of our colleagues at Yale, somewhat maliciously on Twitter, I think, said something to the effect that, at Yale, all the undergraduates know who Václav Havel is. And that was a reference to Professor Shore and her class on the history of ideas, which is regarded by Yale students as the best class at Yale. I mean, if you take the student ratings, and is one of the major classes at Yale. And so they all do know something about Havel. All of these children do know something about Havel. But that's because Marci Shore chooses to teach him in this larger, in the context of a larger class about the history of ideas, in which there's phenomenology and there's Patočka, and Havel pops up, and they read Power of the Powerless, and they have actually not exactly the context that you mentioned, but they have a certain context in which to understand Havel, and by the time they get to Havel, the things that he's saying make a certain kind of sense. So I think it's really up to us. I mean, I'm trying to write a book about freedom now, which Havel figures, and I'm using Havel, I think, in a slightly unpredictable way. I do not belong to the group of people who knew Havel or was old enough to know Havel. I talked to him once or twice, but I mean, I was in 1989. I was myself a student, so I'm not part of this. I'm not part of this closed circle. And in Belarus and Russia and Ukraine, I mean, it's actually not so self-evident. It's interesting, I think, that Havel could be relevant, but you sort of have to make the point. So, I mean, I'm sort of cheating now, but I did actually talk to Zelensky about Havel 2 weeks ago.
And I'm sorry, since this is a language panel, that was in Ukrainian?
It was in Ukrainian. Yeah,
Which is not President Zelensky's original language, we might...
Well, this is okay, but it's not my original language either.
But you speak them all, so...
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm gonna say with all due modesty, his Ukrainian is actually much better than mine. I mean, I think I was putting him at ease. But so it was somewhere in between where we talked about Havel, and he said, oh yes, Havel, right? It wasn't at the top of his mind, but he did know about Havel. And so speaking of phrases, and you know, so we talked about not the ammunition in the ride, but we talked about a moment which I think is actually even more important than that, the moment where Zelensky, it's the second or third night of the war, and the Russians are claiming that he's fled because, of course, that's the predictable thing. That's what anybody would do. Might makes right. Of course, he has fled. He can't possibly be still in Ukraine or Kiev. And Zelensky comes out with his phone, and he makes a film of himself and his crew, basically his friends who are running the executive branch. And he says, "President tut," you know. And then he just, like, the president is here. And then he puts the camera at everyone else's face. And he says, the advisor is here, the head of the parliament is here, the prime minister is here. And that's all that's on the film. President tut, the president's here. That's it, right? And that is living in truth in the Havelian sense, because he's saying something which is true, but in being in a position to say it, he is taking a risk, a clear bodily risk, because he's in Kiev at a moment when the assassins are on the way to kill him, and when the bombs and the missiles are falling on the city. And so it's the living in truth in that. I mean, it's a very simple example, but it's not just that you're describing a world in a way which is accurate, it's that in saying the thing that you're saying, you're taking a certain kind of risk. So I talked to him about this, and I said, you know, that is Życie w prawdy, okay, that's Ukrainian for living in truth. And so then he started using the phrase Życie w prawdy. And then later in our conversation, he kept saying Życie w prawdy. And I will be very surprised if in the future he doesn't use in public the phrase Życie w prawdy, right? And so with the phrases, I think it's partly up to us. I mean, I take the point about how, like, there can be circles and it can be closed. But I think Havel, I mean, so it's partly for the reasons that you give, synthesizers tend to be the people who you can then push onward, right? So I think it's possible, but I think it's very much open to us and the connections we're able to make.
Michael was going to say something.
Yeah, well, you know, Havel's ability, like Zelensky's, to coin these lines, these phrases, was uncanny. But, you know, sometimes also a little problematic. By far and large, his most famous line is, "Truth and love must prevail over lies and hatred." You know, it was understandable in the context that he said it during one of the largest demonstrations on the Wenceslas Square on the 10th of December, 1989, and he jotted a few lines of his speech, and then he said, well, you know, at the end, I should say something powerful, shouldn't I? So this is what he came up with, but, you know, it's better not to analyze it too deeply, because, you know,
I disagree with that. I think that it's a very profound statement.
No.
You know, he actually revisited, because it stuck to him like a bad smell, and a lot of people. I mean, there's this.
No, because it implies, Paul, that regardless of everything else, love and truth must prevail over lies and hatred, so we don't have to do anything. You know, what he really had in mind is, you know, we can make love and truth prevail over lies and hatred, but he forgot to insert the human element in it, and it's and in this way it sounds like an automatic axiom, and it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
But, okay.
It depends. There is a musí zvítězit, which
Is
means
it
it's
musí?
musí.
Must.
Must, shall, should, etc., etc. So there are several possible explanations of the.
That's the language.
Yeah.
Listen, before we take questions from the audience, let me throw one last thing into the debate. Coming from a different generation, I don't know, obviously I'm not neither a philosopher nor a literary critic. Rereading on Havel's plays recently, one thing that strikes me that could be inspirational perhaps is Havel's constant self-doubt. To me it sounds like a linguistical trait very characteristic to lots of his plays, essays, speeches. Havel uses a word and he immediately questions whether the word was appropriately chosen. Havel becomes president and immediately he questions his motives for achieving a position of power. Is this perhaps one of Havel's linguistic legacies, that sometimes we're too sure of ourselves, that we don't self-doubt? Do we doubt ourselves
It's
enough?
a part of a broader trait, you know, his ability of self-reflection, introspection, and questioning of his own motives and his own actions made him what he was. Yes.
Professor?
And in my opinion, it's again, it's a broader Czech stream. It's not just Havel, it's the tradition of Masaryk and Čapek and
Kafka.
Kafka, questioning himself. Actually, do I really believe what I am telling? I am believing in, etc., etc. This
it's a nice mechanism, right?
Yes, you know.
I mean, you're a very convinced man, but still.
Yes, I would say this is maybe the core of what we can call Czech identity. This wavering, this hesitating, what is the Czech national identity? Is it the Protestant or the Catholic? Or the leftist? Is it co Czech, co Sokol, or every Czech must be a Hussite, every Czech must be a Catholic, etc. And there are so many changes of definition. What does it mean to be Czech?
We are
together with this.
We are the only country in the world with an anthem which ends in a question mark. Where is my home?
Where is my homeland?
Which is also the perfect punchline.
One more. Just mention America, if I may. And this Czech identity line also is connected with the American again, with the Masaryk's connection with the American religion, namely with the Unitarianism, with the Transcendentalism, and with this uncertainty about beliefs, but certainty about ethics. So I think this may be the punchline. So Havel, yes, but we can understand Havel also as an American thinker, whereas about Russia he knew nothing.
Let's take some questions from the audience, if there's any. So, do we have any questions? Yes, yes. If we could ask for Miss. just so you know, this is Wendy Lures asking.
Joseph Papp at the Public Theater obviously understood what Havel was trying to express and was the person who put him on the stage in the United States.
Yes.
But I think, and this is Martina, partially for you, I think, the code words inside of the plays that were sending messages to the Czechs or to anybody else living under a totalitarian society was not well understood by Americans and by the regular American public, which is why he was sort of not considered a great playwright. It was because the issue that he was dealing with was something that could not be understood by the general American public. Do you agree?
Yes. Yes, I think it depends very much on the Czech context or on the totalitarian context. if you live in a country which has so dominant tradition of freedom of speech, etc., you are missing something. It's not your fault. It's just a different context. And again, talking back about who is it us and about the young generation, etc. I'm quite often talking about Havel and about the dissident movement with my students, and they are, most of them, very critical, saying, okay, we understand that in that context against the communist regime, okay, it was necessary, but they were missing, Havel and his generation, they were missing something. They completely omitted the social question, saying that all socialism in general is wrong. And so today I have a message for my students, for Professor Snyder. When I told them that I am going to talk together with you, they said, please, because they definitely read you, and please tell to him. I just quote my students that we the leftist students are not the enemies. We hate Trump and Putin as much as you do. We are just different. That's what I'm not commenting on it. It's just message from my students to you. You can deal with it.
I'd say young people are socially minded, always have been. It'd be hard to find young conservatives, right?
Okay, just one from an old man. One comment on Havel's reception abroad. I realized that his reception in America was somewhat limited to New York and intellectuals, but that was not the case in Europe. In Europe, he was widely produced and played, and Kenneth Tynan, an authority on European theater in 1967, declared him the greatest living European playwright, and that was before he was dissident, before he was president. That was purely on the merits of his writing. So.
Yes, but this is because of the context of French and British theater at the time.
I've got an idea. Let's do another question. From
sorry. Good. I shut my mouth.
We will sort it out.
We've got time for two more. So yes, please.
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Maria. I'm a student at Colby College. I'm sure some of you may have seen the pictures of lines that formed on the Russian-Georgian border, like recently, of Russians fleeing the draft. So the European Union and the US call those people, families and men in particular, like the official term people use is political refugees, which I personally think is super soft, deeply inappropriate. And since our conference, since our panel is about the language, I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on the ways to push back on that official terms? Because obviously fleeing the draft does not make you a war opposition, does not mean that you oppose imperialistic Russia. Fleeing the draft does not mean that you're a political refugee.
Thank you. Actually, to even frame that a little further, when we mentioned the memorandum, Michael Žantovský in his biography of Havel mentions the memorandum as the first play where Havel raised the idea of, or the question of the passive participation on evil. Now, if we translate passive participation on evil into today's terms, we're talking collective guilt or collective responsibility. What are your thoughts on that regarding Russia? Professor Snyder, for example.
So first, since we're on video and I was asked the question by Martin, I'm going to answer that question, which is that in the Czech left, thanks to my good friends on the Czech left, there's slightly a parody of me which circulates, which is that I'm only an anti-totalitarian thinker. So I would suggest to your students that they first read what I've written about social injustice, ecology, and healthcare, which is actually at the core of my work, which I don't think they have read, and then see how much difference remains after that. So I'm sort of puzzled by this idea that I'm not on the left and the lefty students aren't going to understand me, because the reason they haven't understand me is they haven't read my books. That's my answer, and we'll see how far it goes.
Thank you very much, and I will tell it.
It's on video. So. So on this important question about words, it reaches something which is very central to what we've been talking about, I think, because the war in Russia, this goes back to one of your questions, the war in Russia is popular as a television war. So it's popular as a war in unreality. It's popular as a war that people get to watch on television. It's a war of spectacle. And spectacle is, I think, important. If you think of Havel and Havel's opposition to television and the importance of television in Russia, this kind of all hangs together. It's the war is popular so long as it's a war that you watch on TV and other people fight it. Indigenous people, poor people, but not me here in Moscow, not my brother, not my son, not me. The moment that the war becomes real is the moment of this full mobilization, right? And when the Russians themselves realize, actually all the men, we can all be mobilized, and so they just run like hell. And that is a chance for them, that's a chance to confront the reality of their own political system, as I understand it. And so I would see these people as apolitical immigrants who should be returning as political participants, something like that. Because if we allow everyone to leave Russia at the moment, which is actually their chance to confront the essential political reality of their own system, we're denying them that chance, in effect. There's nothing political about running at the moment when the war becomes real. The political would begin when they take action in their own country, which has to do with the fact that their country is fighting a war of extermination against their neighbor. So that's the kind of language that I would use around this issue.
I have another suggestion.
It's tricky. I mean, Czechoslovakia owed its existence in 1918 in large part to large numbers of Austrian-Hungarian soldiers in the Austrian-Hungarian army who deserted from in Russia.
Yeah, but in order to fight for a cause.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I think.
Sorry, we're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, I think we have enough. Some of them were politically motivated, but many of them just simply wanted to get out of the war as young men, as young men do. But they did serve Masaryk and others as a very potent justification for Czechoslovakian independence. And it's, at the moment, it's a practical problem for us, because there is some controversy back home whether we should grant them residence as
basically the Czechs say no, the Germans
Russians
say yes.
Coming, or whether we should grant them political asylum, or whether we should kick them out as enemy aliens.
Yeah. I mean, but there's certainly Russians who, I mean, just to be clear, there's certainly Russians who should be recognized as political exiles. And there certainly should be Russians who should be recognized as political immigrants. But the triggering mechanism of mobilization is not a good filter to allow you to separate those Russians from other Russians. That's what I'm trying to say.
And I agree, but perhaps we should be able to ask them for clarification as far as their motifs are concerned.
If I may shortly.
Professor. Professor Tismăneanu.
Yes, this is extremely important. And I was thinking about East Germans in Hungary in 1989. Were they political refugees or just tourists who decided to go and stay in a family? In my view, without doubt, they were political refugees. That's my answer. And they were treated accordingly by the German regime, who wanted them back, and by the intervention of Genscher and other people who knows it very well. Okay, that's one thing. Second, the people who tried to leave GDR before the war or after the war. Is the wall jumper a political refugee, or is it just a person who goes there for the Kaufhalle? No, he's a political refugee. My answer is very clear. And they should be treated like political refugees. they are basically conscientious objectors in a country that does not recognize conscientious objection. The East German, the problem, peace and human rights, as we know from the East German experience of peace movement, peace and human rights cannot be separated. These people, by asserting their human right not to serve in Putin's army, which is an imperialist fascist army, they are already making the statement that the greengrocer makes at the moment he doesn't put the F sign in the window. Okay? So they are saying no, and that's the beginning of something. So I think the West has to deal with it. I think this is we refugees. I mean, we didn't ask Hannah Arendt to go back to Germany and organize a resistance movement there.
Right, but we didn't.
Or we didn't ask Walter Benjamin.
But Vladimir, the power of the greengrocer was not that he left Czechoslovakia. I mean, the essay doesn't end with the greengrocer leaving Czechoslovakia. The essay, so if you're right, I mean, these are things that are happening right now, and you could be entirely right, and I could be entirely wrong. But it seems to me that if you're right, and this is the moment that they're hanging a sign, then let them live with the consequences of hanging a sign. Because the moment they leave for the West, it doesn't matter that they've hung a sign. It doesn't matter at all. If they go back to, if they stay in Russia, if there are hundreds of thousands of Russians who have hung a sign and stay in Russia, I think that matters for the future of the world. If there are hundreds of thousands of Russians that hang a sign and go to Germany, I think that matters not at all. I think they add nothing.
I'm sorry.
Okay,
I
want to answer the question directly, and I agree that it's not an appropriate phrase. I think the more appropriate phrase would be draft dodger. And maybe the reason why we're not using it is because it brings up memories of the Vietnam War, and when Canada welcomed thousands and thousands of young men coming, fleeing the United States and making a new life in Canada, and so I think that would be a better phrase than refugees. A better word, actually.
At the risk of depriving you of lunch, let's do one more question, please. Yes. Yes.
So, my question is, what do you think the chances are of some sort of legitimate sort of uprising or upheaval occurring in Russia? Because, currently, or I don't know, within the next few months? Because I think if you look at Russian history, right before there was some sort of revolution or regime change, Russia suffered some sort of humiliating military defeat. So before the Bolshevik Revolution, it was World War I, right? And I guess before the Soviet Union collapsed, it was the war in Afghanistan. And so I'm wondering, what do you think the chances of that happening are?
Professor Snyder?
So the challenge to a good panelist would be to hook this back to the theme of the crisis of language, which is gonna take some work. I appreciate the historical references, and one could add to them, of course, the partial democratization of the Russian Empire after defeat with Japan, which is a good analogy because that was another war which they thought they were fighting against an inferior people and would be over very quickly. Or an analogy which is good, or at least appealing for obvious reasons, is the Crimean War, right? After they lost in Crimea in the 1850s, that began the period of the Great Reforms of the 1860s. I've been thinking a lot myself about the 1560s, which some of you will know what I mean. It was the bad years for Ivan IV, the years that got him known as Ivan the Terrible, when after having won a bunch of wars in the south, he turned west and fought in Livonia, which led to unexpected European cooperation and domestic problems back home, and all kinds of chaos, including men, running around carrying out purges, wearing hoods, and carrying the severed heads of wolves. That's an invitation to study Russian history, by the way, so you know what I'm talking about, the 1560s and the Oprychniki. So I think that a lot, whether there'll be change in Russia, I don't think the kind that you're talking about. I think that Putin will fall, but they always fall. Whether it's going to be interesting, I don't know. I think this is a good moment, maybe this is a point we could agree on. I think it's a good moment to be very careful with how we describe what's happening in Russia. I think we have to be very conceptually clear about what kind of regime this is and what kind of a ruler Putin is, because that might help to limit our expectations about what could happen next. There might be reform, but there won't be reform with the current crew, because, to use a phrase which comes from 1968, there's been a lot of negative selection of the people who are at the top. right? And there's been a lot of negative selection in general in Russia. That a lot of this goes to Vlad's point and to the question as well. A lot of the people that one would want to give asylum to have already left, or and the people who are still joining the army now have been negatively selected for in a lot of different ways. So yes, I think there will be change in Russia in the short term. I think there will be change, but that change is going to have to do with a fragmentation at the top of a regime. Putin, I mean, going back to Shakespeare, Putin has played, he's just been a classical tyrant in all of this. Like the Plato's analysis of tyranny will get you, I'm sorry, now I'm being conservative, I'm not talking about healthcare. Plato's analysis of tyranny will get you very far in understanding Putin. He's overplayed his hand, he's been in power too long, he has a fantasy, he has an obsession, he wants to leave a trace after he's gone. This is how you fall, right? This is how you fall, and it's how he is falling. But when he does fall, it's going to be remnants of the other institutions that are somehow up there, the FSB, the army, that will somehow, in the short term, come in and fill the gaps. I think in the medium term, or the long term, Russia could change, but I don't think that there's going to be an immediate transformation where Russians will rise up and they'll be, we'll be looking at a different country. I bet other people have things to say about this, though, even though it's new.
There is always change in Russia when it loses a war. Maybe there's only change in Russia when it loses a war. The Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, the First World War, and the Cold War. The problem is that sometimes the change can be for the worse. I mean, what followed Russia's armistice agreement with Germany brought about 70 years of the Bolshevik regime. So my line is, we collectively should first see to it that Russia loses this war, and then there will almost certainly be a change, but there's a caveat: watch out what you wish for, because it might come true.
All right, thank you, everybody. I suggest we take the optimistic, hopeful images of both Vladimir Putin falling and Russia reforming and ponder over them for lunch. And we thank you all, and we'll meet back here at 1 p.m., I believe, as the next debate, where you'll be able to ask more questions. Thank you for your patience. Thank you to our wonderful guests.